Howdy folks, I'm Mark. I make stuff, and today we're talking about Swatchity, a social media site where you can only post colors. Now, you may be thinking that this is a painfully stupid idea, and you would be right. You might also be missing the point because, like a lot of my side projects, Swatchity is primarily an exercise. I had actually made an earlier version of this several years ago and wanted to make a new version with modern libraries and frameworks and, of course, TypeScript. This video series is going to walk through that process. Psst, there's another video or two about the idea and the original mid-2010s version of this, so I don't want to repeat that here. There is probably a link in the upper right corner, right now. Probably. Cards on the table, I actually finished this new version a little while ago. You can go to swatchity.com right now and play around with it. In this video series, we'll walk through how this was done, step by step, so you can use these ideas and patterns to build something of your own. Who knows, you might manage to make something that people might find actually useful. This project uses NextJS, TypeScript, Prisma for ORM, MongoDB for DB, and Next-Auth for authentication. And because this may be seen by new engineers or folks who are unfamiliar with the project management processes of a working software engineering team, I broke the project down into several user stories and will be going over each one in their own video. And the first of these is this video, right here, the one you're watching. Additionally, I slowed down my usual process to better model these practices. I tend to work very quickly on side projects, usually due to a paucity of free time and attention, but it can also lead to mistakes, bad accessibility, and poor test coverage. So before checking in any code for a given user story, I ran accessibility checks in Axe and made sure the test coverage was reasonably high for the relevant files. So here we are at user story 1, SW001, as if there were really going to be like hundreds of user stories. Anyway, basic authentication. The user story goes like this. When a user visits the app, they can log in or create an account. There are a lot of things that are implied by that, including database access, authentication, and the basic Next setup. So here we go. Okay, as you can see in this early version of the package file, we're using Next. This was just created with a create Next app npx script, and we're using TypeScript, handy dandy's TypeScript. We're not going to worry too much about styling yet because you'll see in the demo for this branch it's very, very unstyled. We're using Next-Auth in this case. We're using the Prisma adapter for that. Prisma is our ORM that we're using to connect to the database. And we're using the Prisma client. And so all of those kind of work together. And then that's eventually going to connect to a Mongo database. We're using the Atlas Database as a Service product from Mongo because it's cheap and it's pretty good. So we're going to go over some of that. Other than that, it's fairly bare bones. We're using Prettier. We're using ESLint, obviously. All of that was stuff that we were able to set up fairly quickly and easily. You know, we've got like a bare bones Prettier setup. We've got our next config, and then our jest config here, and then our setup just enables our fetch mock for mocking fetch requests, right? Which is going to be really instrumental when we test our API calls. Our next config, very straightforward at this point. We have a couple of env variables that I was paranoid about them not getting through to production. I don't even think this is strictly necessary. On the GitHub repo for the main branch, you should see in the README, it'll have a full list of all of the env variables you'll need to run this locally or in production, right? So all of that is there. So let's talk about the main thing we're going to be doing in this step is our authentication, right? So when somebody logs in, they're going to be hitting these routes that are all handled by this file. This is really your Next-Auth config file, for lack of a better term. So we're using 3 providers: Google, GitHub, and Twitch. So they're all right here. We're pulling them right in, and we're using the Prisma adapter, which we talked about. Prisma adapter is going to require us to do some setup in our schema, which we'll go over here in a second. But once we do that, it's going to give us a lot more control over how Next-Auth is set up within our environment, and also allow us to get into our database to clear out sessions and things like that, all through our database. Pretty easy and very cool. So for these 3 providers, in my case, I went through and created separate Swatchity accounts, got API access, created apps. Each one of these providers is going to require you to do slightly different stuff to get the ID and secret. All of that is covered in the Next-Auth documentation. I wish all documentation was as good as the Next-Auth docs. They're great. And while you're at it, when you're in these accounts for your Google, your GitHub, and your Twitch, it's going to ask for a callback URL. Your callback URL is going to look something like that, right? So it's, in this case, my local host, API auth callback GitHub, right? And then Twitch or Google, right? So that's actually all of those are being handled by the same route. And when we demo this in a second, I'll show you. The thing about the callback URLs that you want to bear in mind is that of these 3, 2 of them will allow me to have multiple callback URLs based on where it's coming from, right? So if it's coming from my local, it knows to send it back to my local. If I'm coming from production, it knows to send it back to production, right? Not all of them will let you do that. So I believe these 2, you can have multiple callback URLs, which is great. But as you add other environments like staging and production, you're going to need to go back in and add those. I found it was no big deal just to have multiple and then know that, I wasn't going to test locally. Once I went to production, I was going to test locally with some of these. But it sometimes makes sense to create separate tenants for dev and prod for this very reason, right? So that's how that works. And this is all going to be pulling in, the Prisma adapter is going to be pulling in schema from here. So this is our schema file for Prisma. There's actually a very simple boilerplate Prisma DB, which is just this. It sets up the client. This is all just really boilerplatey, straight out of the documentation. So I'm not going to get into this in any detail. The schema up here, we have our, again, boilerplate stuff that just tells the system what we're working with. These tables, we actually would call them collections because we're in Mongo, but we can call them tables if you want. These table definitions will, you can kind of see a pattern here where we have our ID. It's of type string, and note that these are actually legit TypeScript types. So when if I'm in a test or if I'm in a component and I just say import account, it will know, it'll autofill with, oh, you want to bring that in from the Prisma client, and it'll just do it. It's great. So it knows it's an ID. It knows it's an object ID. It knows that if it doesn't exist, it can create one automatically. And this is an optional thing that I like to do that maps the underscore ID field to the ID field. It's just a preference thing. I just think it feels cleaner to me, but I can see people having different opinions. If you have different opinions, please let me know in the comments, but I just think that's interesting. If you see a question mark, that means it's optional. That's kind of intuitive. Also very TypeScript-like. So this is very TypeScript friendly. It's pretty great in that way. So once someone logs in, it's going to use these tables now. this user table, there was a time when I might use that user table and extend it to add custom user fields. There are some issues with that in development. It created some problems. So instead of doing that, we actually use this user meta collection that has all of the application specific, and I think we added a few more in later branches, but same idea. We know it's an ID. We can add an ID automatically. We map the underscore ID. We're setting our username and saying it has to be unique. The email has to be unique. So it's all basic stuff, everything you would expect. We're not going to get into detail on this data structure just yet because we can go over that later, but you can kind of see how relationships are set up too. So let's take a look at the way the swatch is set up. Swatch is like a post in this world, right? So our swatch is posted by a user. So the author would be user. It's going to pull from the user meta table, right? And it's going to run that relation on user ID. So the user ID here. And then this swatch, if we wanted to, later on, we actually can include, when we bring in the swatch, we can include the user. It does not, by default, bring in the user from this relationship unless we tell it to. And what's great is that prevents those kinds of default slowdowns you can run into in some database setups. Like sometimes with Graph, if you bring things in by default, it can, some of your reducers can really slow things down. What's really nice with this is you could, unless you tell it to bring in the user, it won't do it. So that's nice, keeps things nice and fast. These other data types are for later use. So that's how this works. So let's take a look at what happens when somebody hits the site, right? So we have our application. So you can see we're wrapping it with some providers. The session provider is specific to Next-Auth. That's what lets us use the use session hook that we'll get into. That's going to let us know, is the user logged in? And if they're logged in, what user are they logged in as, right? Then we have this UserContext provider, which is a custom hook. We'll get into that in a second. Intl provider is for our internationalization. So that's from React Intl. You can see up here we have a couple of locales slugged in. In part 11, I believe, of this video series, we will have this kitted out with our full lang packs, English and French, and I think we have Chinese, simplified Chinese, and Hindi, all kinds of fun stuff. And it's probably really poorly translated. So if you see some mistakes in the translation, please let me know. So if you go into profile, and you can say set language, and we'll set it to Hindi, and we'll say, okay, it doesn't change the language until, it doesn't change the language until we hit okay, but we've changed it. And then we can set it back to auto. I only know that says auto because it's the first item in the list. The first item is always auto. That's how that works. So that's our internationalization. The user context provider is probably the most important thing. But what we want to do is take a look at our index page. This is our home page. So currently it does almost nothing at all, right? You can see it's going to use this session, this use session, to see, are we logged in? It's going to say, is there a session? Is there not? Are we logged in? Are we not? It's even going to know, are we loading the authentication? Are we loading the session? And if we have a session and you're logged in, it's going to say, yo, you're logged in, right? And let you sign out. This is very, very simple, but it's wrapped in this thing called layout. But our application as a whole, right, it's wrapped in this user context provider. Let's take a look at that, because that is where, as they say, the magic happens. It is also going to be calling this use session hook. This is really where it'd be called. This is a standard context hook. This allows us to avoid prop drilling, things like that. And you can see right now, the only thing we're really providing in our context is the user metadata and whether or not it's a new user, right? And later on, we make this more robust. We're going to add some other features to it. But for right now, all we're really doing is we're using some useState instances to check, is the session loaded? Is it a new user? And then this is the main one, user meta, right? So if the session changes, every time the session changes, we're going to check, have we already found a session? Is there a session? Is there a user? Are we logging in for the first time? If we're logging in for the first time since the browser was loaded, then we're going to set those use states and we're going to do check user meta. Check user meta is going to do a couple of things. It's going to run get user meta. And if get user meta returns with a user, meaning we found you, you're an existing user, it's going to set the user meta with the data that was returned. And we'll go over these two functions here in a second. If we don't find it, we're going to create the user, right? We're going to create a user meta that is associated with this session email. That's why the email has to be unique. And then once we do that, then we set new user true. So let's take a look at get user meta. So get user meta, you can see these are very simple functions. Get user meta, all it's doing is it is checking our API user meta, read user meta, right? So let's look at it. API user meta, read user meta. And here it is. We have our little stub here that tells us what it's used for. These API requests, if you've ever really played around with Vercel, this will end up getting turned into a Lambda at the end of the day. That's why one of the reasons why hosting on Vercel can be really inexpensive, because infrastructure-wise, it's very lightweight. So it's going to check the server session, right, from Next-Auth. And this is a way we're doing it on, again, we're on server side now. We're not on client side. It's going to say, is there a session? Right? It's going to check that session. It's going to say, does the email that was provided match the email that we're getting from the session? So it's a bit of a security check, right? And if it's not, it's gonna throw an error, and we're gonna get it down here, and it's gonna be based on invalid data, right? So we're gonna look for that user. So here's the pattern you're gonna see a bunch with Prisma. Again, Prisma's our ORM, so it's just making communicating with the database much, much easier. So Prisma user meta, which is the name of our collection or table, find unique, meaning we should only be able to find one. And because email is a unique field, we can do this. And this is a very quick query because of that. We're saying find unique where email, right? We don't have to say emails equals email because it's the same thing, right? So if user meta exists with an ID, meaning if we actually have a result, then success is true, and we return that. Otherwise, we return user meta. Let's take a look at create user meta. Create user meta is very similar. Again, all we're really doing is running that fetch to same thing. Instead of read user meta, we go to create user meta. And again, right there, this one's a little more complicated because what we're doing is we're taking the email address and the name, and we're creating a user meta and filling in all the information we don't know yet with default data, right? So the score is 0, the level is 1. Score and level, those are related to kind of the gamification of the site. So as you post more and people like your posts, if your swatches become popular, then you get a score. At a certain point, your score rises to a point where you go up in a level, right? And it'll tell you. You'll get a Toastify message saying, hey, you leveled up. In the original version of this, I used this to tell a story. So it was kind of an experiment. So as your level increased, then the graphics on the site would change, And part of the joke was that this was part of a club. You might call it a cult in the old version. It was a fictional cult that ran the whole thing. And that carried over to this one, because if you go to the news section and read through these news articles, the early ones, you'll see that there's it really hints, like especially in this one about the comet, it really hints that, yeah, they're a cult. So there are other fields in here that are changed later on, and that's one of the reasons why you're seeing this error here, because it's looking to the active Prisma schema, right, that we've pushed out into production. It's seeing that it's different. Now, if I wanted to publish this, if I made a change to my schema, for example, I would just go npx, again, I'm running a remote script, Prisma db publish, which I won't do because again, this is changed and I don't want to change it. So that's how UserContext works. Let's take a look at our user story here. As you can see, these are the user stories we were talking about earlier. These are the things that we're going to be working on later, the threads, the alerts, the messaging, all fun stuff. We're not there yet. We're still doing this basic thing. So we don't have any styling in. This is very, very simple stuff. You're going to be really disappointed when I demo this, but when a user visits the app, they can log in or create an account, right? That's all the user story is. Very, very simple, but it's a lot of setup to get that to work. Let's run that locally, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. All right. So at first, you notice that for just a half second or so, it loaded the page and we didn't see the login button. And that was because it was still loading the session. It didn't know if you were still logged in. It was checking for that. So that's something later on we're going to have a little animation, some CSS animation that kind of covers that transition. So let's log in. This is the only thing that's styled. This is sort of the default Next-Auth styling. It's in dark mode because my machine is in dark mode. We can log in through Google or GitHub or Twitch. We're going to try Twitch. Twitch is the only one that gives us this little interstitial. The other ones just basically just go straight through. And again, it gives us this kind of like half second where it's thinking about it. And now we're logged in. It says, yo, you are logged in. Look how unstyled that is. Not even a space between layout and Swatchity. But you get a sense of that's, again, very, very simple. I apologize for how simple this is, but we're going to make cool, fun stuff. We're just not quite there yet, right? We got another couple steps to go before we do fun stuff. But that is how that works. As far as the testing is concerned, let's talk about that. So we have some fixtures. At this point, it's just mock user data, but we really make use of our fixtures. Every type of data that we've got, news posts, swatches, swatch replies, swatch likes, all of that stuff we have as mock data so we can easily get to that. So I've been moving away from Enzyme and toward React testing library, as you can see here. And I really like it. It allows you to do some fairly elaborate click sequences and things like that, which I really appreciate. Some of these tests are kind of rough at this point, but if you go to the GitHub, you'll be able to see like where the tests ended up, where our test coverage ended up. Test coverage is pretty good. There were a couple of things I'd love to go back in and fix. So for some tests, we're actually wrapping it in a mock session provider, a UserContext provider, that kind of stuff. Sometimes we have to do that. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Later on, you'll see we're using a lot of mocks like this, where we're mocking. In this case, we're mocking the two API functions because we don't really need to worry about those. We're testing those separately, so we can just mock them and just return what we want to return. That allows us to test very quickly and without having to worry about any of that stuff. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at those tests. And in the comments, let me know how you would improve those. Maybe don't judge me based on this round of tests. They get a little better over the course of the project, but that's all I've got. On the next one, we're going to be doing the basic layout UI, and that is going to be, header and nav and all that stuff to match the wireframes. I did wireframes in Inkscape. I used Inkscape for a lot of the, all of these icons, all of these patterns. These were things that were either created entirely in Inkscape, or they were brought into Inkscape from other sources and tweaked to what I wanted. You can see like that's a home icon, but I peeled back the corner to make it match or at least evoke this this item here. That peeled back corner is evident in other spots too. Because like when I'm making stuff, yeah, I like the technology of it, I like the creative piece, but I like the design piece too. If I'm just doing it myself, I enjoy doing all that stuff. Well, that's all we have for now, and I will see you later when we're looking at the basic UI setup. That's all for now.